I've been a patrol officer for 14 years. I've responded to house fires and traffic fatalities and domestic calls that went bad before I cleared the threshold. I've seen what people do to each other and what accidents do to people and what time does to both. I am not someone who gets rattled easily, and I want that on the record before I tell you what happened on the night of March 8th, because the story is strange enough that I need you to understand who's telling it. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Welfare check, residential address on Dunner Road, rural county route about 12 miles outside of town. The caller was a woman named Sandra Priel, who said she'd been trying to reach her neighbor, an elderly man named Howard Cass, for 3 days without success. She'd knocked twice, seen lights on inside, his truck in the driveway. No answer. She was worried. Standard welfare check. I've done hundreds of them. The majority end one of 3 ways. The person is fine and didn't hear the door, the person is in the hospital and nobody thought to call the neighbor, or the person has died and you're the one who finds them. None of those outcomes require anything from you except professionalism, and in the third case, a few extra minutes of paperwork. I radioed my ETA and drove out to Dunner Road. It was a cold March night, clear sky, the kind of dark you only get on rural roads where the nearest streetlight is 4 miles back. My headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the black. The property was at the end of a long gravel drive, marked with a rusted mailbox and a reflector post. I turned in and drove slowly, gravel popping under the tires. The house came into view at the end of the drive. Small, single-story, white siding gone grey with age. A pickup truck parked at the side, like the neighbor had said. And lights on inside, the warm yellow of incandescent bulbs through curtained windows. Living room and kitchen both lit, from what I could see. I parked, stepped out, and stood for a moment by my cruiser. Everything looked ordinary. The house, the truck, the lit windows. A normal house where a man lived alone and had apparently stopped answering his door for 3 days. I walked up to the front door and knocked. No answer. I waited 30 seconds and knocked again louder, the standard knock that says I'm not leaving. Called out, "Mr. Cass. This is Officer Rourke from the County Sheriff's Department. I'm doing a welfare check. Can you come to the door?" Silence. I moved to the front window and looked through the gap in the curtains. Living room visible from this angle. A couch, an armchair, a television on but muted, the screen showing a late-night talk show. A side table with a lamp. A coffee mug on the table. No one in the room. But the mug was there, and the TV was on, and the lamp was lit, and all of it had the quality of a room that had been recently occupied, not a room that had been sitting empty for 3 days. You develop a sense for that difference. A room with a person in it has a particular energy, even when the person isn't visible. This room had it. I went back to the door. Tried the handle, locked. I radioed dispatch, gave them my status, requested a welfare check authorization. Standard procedure. While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the house, checking the other windows. Kitchen window, lights on, nothing on the stove, a dish rack with a single plate and cup drying beside the sink. Bedroom window, dark, curtains drawn. Back door, locked. Small back porch with a pair of work boots sitting beside it, toes pointed outward. Dispatch came back with the authorization. I returned to the front door, gave one more knock and announcement, and then used the pass key. The door opened. Warm air came out, the specific warmth of a house with the heat running. And with it, faint but unmistakable, the smell. If you've worked patrol long enough, you know it. I knew immediately that Howard Cass had not stopped answering his door because he was in the hospital. I drew my flashlight and went in. Howard Cass was in the kitchen. He was seated at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him and his head bowed, as if he'd fallen asleep in the middle of saying grace. He was wearing flannel pajamas and slippers. A half-finished bowl of soup sat on the table in front of him, a spoon resting in it. He had the stillness of someone who had been still for a very long time. I checked for a pulse. There was none. I radioed dispatch and gave them the situation. Apparent natural death, male approximately 70 to 80 years, no signs of trauma or disturbance. Requested the coroner and a second unit for the report. Then I did what officers do at a death scene while they wait for backup. I secured the perimeter, confirmed there was no one else in the residence, and began a preliminary walkthrough to establish that the death was unattended and non-suspicious. The house was small. Living room, kitchen, one bedroom, one bathroom, a utility room off the kitchen. I moved through each room with my flashlight, supplementing the existing lights. Everything was in order. A tidy house, a man who kept things organized. Books on shelves, arranged by size. A small collection of framed photographs on the bedroom dresser. A younger version of the man at the table. A woman I assumed was his wife, children who were presumably grown and living elsewhere. I found nothing unusual. I came back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at Howard Cass at his kitchen table and thought about the soup and the television and the lamp that was still on, and about the neighbor who'd been knocking for 3 days. 3 days. The coroner would tell us more precisely, but 3 days felt right given the condition of the room. He had been sitting at that table for approximately 3 days. I went back to my cruiser to write up the preliminary report and wait for the second unit. I was in the cruiser for maybe 10 minutes when dispatch came back on. They said, "Rourke, we have a second call for that address." I said, "What kind of call?" They said, "Welfare check. Caller is a woman named Sandra Priel. She says she's been trying to reach her neighbor Howard Cass for 3 days, and she's worried." I sat in my cruiser for a moment. I said, "Dispatch, I'm currently at that address. I already responded to that call. I called in the death 40 minutes ago." Dispatch said, "I understand, but the call came in at 11:47 p.m. It's 11:52 now. You haven't radioed in yet from that location." I looked at the clock on my dash. It read 11:52. I want to be precise about what I'm describing, because imprecision is how this kind of thing gets dismissed. I had arrived at the Dunner Road property. I had knocked. I had done the perimeter check, the pass key entry, the walkthrough. I had found Howard Cass at his kitchen table. I had checked for a pulse. I had radioed dispatch and called in the death. I had done the secondary walkthrough of the residence. I had gone back to my cruiser and begun the preliminary report. All of that had happened, and the clock on my dash said I'd been on scene for 5 minutes. I've been on the job for 14 years. I know how time feels on a call. I know how long a perimeter walk takes, how long it takes to clear a small single-story residence, how long I sit in the cruiser before I start the report. What I had done had taken at minimum 45 minutes, probably closer to an hour. The clock said 5 minutes. I checked my radio log. The transmission where I'd called in the death, not there. The only transmission on my log for the evening was my ETA call from the road, made 12 minutes ago. I sat in the cruiser and I thought carefully and methodically about what was happening, the way 14 years of police work had trained me to think. What do I know? What do I not know? What are the possible explanations? Option 1. I had experienced some kind of dissociative episode. I had driven to the address, sat in my car, and imagined everything that followed. This would account for the time discrepancy and the radio log. It would not account for the fact that I could feel the warmth of the house on my jacket or the smell, which was still in my nostrils. Option 2. There was a technical malfunction with my radio and my dash clock simultaneously. This was theoretically possible and practically absurd. Option 3. Something had happened that I didn't have a category for yet. I got out of the cruiser. I walked back to the front door of the house. I knocked. No answer. I waited. Knocked again. Called out the same thing I'd called out before. Mr. Cass. Officer Rourke, County Sheriff. Welfare check. Silence. I went to the front window and looked through the curtain gap. The living room. The couch, the armchair, the television on and muted. The side table with the lamp. The coffee mug. Exactly as I'd seen it before. I went around the perimeter. Kitchen window, lights on, dish rack, single plate and cup. Bedroom, dark, curtains drawn. Back door, locked. Work boots on the porch, toes pointed out. Exactly as before. I used the pass key. The door opened. Warm air and the smell. Howard Cass was at the kitchen table. Hands folded, head bowed, flannel pajamas and slippers. Half-finished soup in front of him. I checked for a pulse. There was none. I stood in the kitchen of that small house and looked at a dead man I had already found once, and I tried to remain professional and methodical, and I'm going to be honest with you. I nearly didn't manage it. 14 years of training is a strong foundation. What I was standing in was stronger. I radioed dispatch. I said, "This is Rourke. I'm at the Dunner Road address. I have an apparent natural death, male approximately 70 to 80, no signs of trauma. Requesting the coroner and a second unit." Dispatch said, "Copy Rourke. Do you have a time of discovery?" I looked at my watch. It read 12:03 a.m. I said 12:03. Dispatch said, "Copy. Second unit is en route, ETA 14 minutes. I said, "Dispatch, what time did you log my welfare check arrival at this address?" There was a pause. Then, "Rourke, you haven't logged arrival yet. Your last transmission was the ETA call from Route 9, logged at 11:51. I said, "Copy. Thank you." I put the radio down and I stood in the kitchen doorway and I looked at Howard Cass and I thought, how many times has this already happened? The second unit arrived 14 minutes later. Deputy Carla Voss, 6 years on the job, someone I'd worked with enough to trust. She pulled up behind my cruiser and I met her at the door of the house and told her, "Natural death, kitchen table, coroner is coming." Nothing unusual. She said, "You okay? You look pale." I said, "I'm fine. Long night." She went in and I stood on the front porch and breathed the cold March air and tried to organize what had happened into a shape I could hold. Here is what I could establish. I had arrived at this house and done the welfare check and found the body at least twice. Possibly more. Each time, the clock had reset. Each time, when I radioed dispatch, I had no record of having called in before. The house was identical each time, same lights, same mug, same boots on the porch. Here is what I could not establish, how many times it had happened before I noticed. How long I had been arriving at this house and finding this man and walking back to my cruiser. I thought about the soup, the half-finished bowl, the spoon resting in it, the television on but muted, the lamp still burning, a man who had died in the middle of an evening and left everything exactly as it was, the specific quality of a room that has been recently occupied. I thought about the fact that Howard Cass had been dead for approximately 3 days, and yet the room felt occupied, felt present, like someone was still in it. And I thought about the call that had come in at 11:47. The call that had come in again at 11:52. The neighbor who kept calling because her neighbor hadn't answered in 3 days. How many nights had Sandra Priel called? How many times had dispatch sent a unit out to Dunner Road? How many times had someone arrived at this house and knocked on the door and found Howard Cass at his kitchen table and radioed it in and driven away? And how many times had it started over? I got the coroner's report 3 days later. Howard Cass had died of cardiac arrest. Time of death estimated between 72 and 84 hours before discovery. Consistent with what I'd seen. I submitted my report. Time of discovery, 12:03 a.m., March 8th. Nothing unusual noted. I didn't include what had happened before 12:03. I've thought a lot about why, and the honest answer is, I didn't know how to describe it in a way that fit any box on the form. There is no category, for I arrived at this address an indeterminate number of times and found the same dead man, and each time the clock reset, and I had no record of having been there before. I talked to Carla about it. Not in those terms. I didn't tell her about the clock or the radio log or the fact that I'd done the walkthrough twice. I told her that the scene had felt strange in a way I couldn't explain. She nodded. She said, some scenes are like that. Old houses, people who lived alone a long time. They hold something. I said, you felt that before? She said, sure. Haven't you? I said, not like this. She looked at me for a moment. She said, what happened out there? I said, I don't know how to describe it. She said, try. So I told her. All of it. The walk through, the body, the radio call, the clock reading 11:52. The second call from dispatch. Going back in. Finding him again. The soup that hadn't changed, the boots on the porch, the mug on the table. She listened without saying anything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, do you think it's over? Or do you think it's still happening out there? I'd thought about that. I'd thought about it since I drove away from Dunner Road with the coroner's van behind me. I said, I think it stopped when we took him out of the house. I think whatever was looping, it needed him there to keep looping. Once he was gone, actually gone, not just dead, it ended. She said, and if you're wrong? I didn't answer that. There's one more thing I haven't told anyone until now. The second time I entered the house, the time I radioed in at 12:03, I did the walkthrough again before Carla arrived. Same as before. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, utility room. Everything identical. Except in the bedroom, on the dresser with the framed photographs, there was something that hadn't been there the first time. A small notepad. The kind you keep by the phone. And on the top sheet, in handwriting that was shaky but legible, the handwriting of an old man who knew his hands weren't as steady as they'd once been, 3 words. I've been trying to decide how to interpret those 3 words for 2 months. I've run through every explanation. He wrote it before he died, and I missed it the first time. It was always there, and I missed it. My mind manufactured it as a response to an experience it couldn't process. I've run through all of those, and I keep coming back to the same place. The notepad had not been there the first time. I am certain of that. The dresser surface had been clear. And the 3 words Howard Cass had written were, someone keeps coming. I think about that on night shifts. I think about a man at a kitchen table with his hands folded and his head bowed, and a notepad on his dresser. and whatever part of him was still in that house watching a patrol officer arrive at his door again and again and again. I think about whether he was trying to warn whoever finally found it, or whether he was asking for help. I don't know the answer. I don't know if there is one. What I know is that I drove out to Dunner Road on the night of March 8th to do a standard welfare check. And I still don't know how many times I arrived. The stretch of State Route 9 between Colford Junction and the Harlan County line is 22 miles of two-lane highway through scrub pine and open farmland. No towns, no gas stations, no traffic lights. The kind of road where you can drive for 15 minutes without seeing another pair of headlights coming the other way. I know every mile of it. I've been patrolling it for 11 years. Mile marker 9 is where the road dips into a shallow valley and crosses a concrete bridge over Bellam Creek. The bridge is narrow, 2 lanes, but barely. The guardrail's close enough that a wide truck has to slow down and pick its line. There's a pull-off on the north side of the bridge, 20 feet of gravel where road crews park when they are doing maintenance on the guardrails. I've stopped there 100 times to run radar or write reports or eat a sandwich. It's a nothing spot, a functional detail of the road, not a place. I'm telling you about the bridge first because the bridge matters. Everything that happened is connected to that bridge, though I didn't understand that until later. The first time I saw her was on a Tuesday night in October, 11 years into my career. I was running the Route 9 corridor on the overnight shift, 2 a.m. to 10 a.m., the quietest stretch of the quietest shift in our district. Almost nothing happens on Route 9 between 2 and 6 in the morning. The occasional trucker, the occasional deer, the occasional call from dispatch about something 2 counties over that I'm the closest unit to. I was heading northbound, approaching the Bellam Creek Bridge, when my headlights caught something on the shoulder. A girl. Standing on the gravel pull-off on the north side of the bridge, facing the road. Young teenage, maybe 16 or 17. Dark coat, no bag visible, no phone in her hand. Just standing there at 2:14 in the morning on a road with no houses for 4 miles in either direction, watching my cruiser approach. I pulled into the pull-off and stopped. Rolled down the window. She was closer now. Dark hair, pale face. The coat she was wearing too thin for an October night that was sitting at 41 degrees. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, not frightened, not relieved to see the lights. Something more neutral than either. Patient, almost. I said, "Hey, you okay?" She said, "I need to get to Colford Junction." I said, "What are you doing out here at this hour?" She said, "I was with someone. They left without me." That answer covered a range of situations, none of them good. I got out of the cruiser and did a quick visual check. No obvious injuries, no signs of distress beyond the fact of her being on a dark highway at 2 in the morning. I asked her name. She said Leigh. I asked her last name. She said she'd rather not. I told her I could give her a ride to Colford Junction, that we'd need to call someone to come get her, or I'd need to take her to the substation if there was no one to call. She nodded like this was information she already had. She got in the back of the cruiser. I pulled out of the pull-off and drove north toward Colford Junction. She didn't say anything for about a mile. Then she said, "The bridge is wrong." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Something happened there. A long time ago. It doesn't know it's over." I glanced in the rear view. She was looking out the side window at the dark fields going past. I said, "What happened there?" She didn't answer. We reached Colford Junction 8 minutes later. I pulled into the parking lot of the all-night gas station at the edge of town, the only lit building for miles, and turned around to ask her who I should call. The back seat was empty. I searched the cruiser. I got out and looked around the parking lot. I drove back down Route 9 to the bridge, slowly, with my spotlight going. Nothing on the shoulder, nothing on the bridge, nothing in the pull-off. A girl named Lee had gotten into my cruiser at mile marker 9 and gotten out of it somewhere between there and Colford Junction without me stopping and without me hearing the door open. The doors of a patrol cruiser can't be opened from the inside in the rear compartment. That's the design. Detainees can't let themselves out. You need a handle on the outside or a release from the front. I sat in the parking lot of that gas station for 10 minutes and I thought about what I was going to put in my report. In the end, I wrote, responded to a pedestrian on Route 9 at mile marker 9, approximately 0214 hours. Female, juvenile, possible distress situation. Subject declined to identify herself. Transported to Colford Junction. Subject was not present upon arrival. No further incident. I didn't write the part about the door. I didn't write what she'd said about the bridge. I told myself it had been a strange night, that I'd been on since 2 a.m. and my mind was doing what minds do on overnight shifts when there's nothing to keep them occupied. I told myself there was a rational explanation I wasn't seeing yet. I went back to running the corridor, and I didn't think about Lee for 6 weeks. Then I saw her again. Same bridge. Same pull-off. 3:11 a.m. on a Thursday in late November, temperature in the mid-30s, a light freezing drizzle coming down. I was heading northbound, and my headlights picked her up from 100 yards out, the dark coat, the pale face, the posture of someone who had been standing in one place for a while and was not in a hurry. I pulled in, rolled down the window. She said, I need to get to Colford Junction. The same words. Exactly the same words, the same cadence, as if she'd rehearsed them or as if it was the only sentence she had for this situation. I said, Lee. Something changed in her expression. Slight, barely perceptible, the shift of someone who didn't expect to be recognized. She said, you remember. I said, you were in my cruiser 6 weeks ago. You disappeared somewhere between here and the junction. She said, I know. I'm sorry. I don't always make it all the way. I said, make it all the way where? She looked at me for a moment. The freezing drizzle was coming down, and she wasn't reacting to it, wasn't hunching her shoulders or blinking against the cold the way a person does when cold rain hits their face. She was standing in it, the way a rock stands in rain. She said, can I get in? I said, I need you to answer some questions first. She said, I know, I'll try. I got out of the cruiser. I stood in the drizzle and looked at her from 3 feet away, pale. Dark hair, wet now from the rain, but the wetness sitting on top somehow, not soaking in the way hair soaks in rain. The coat the same coat as before, bone dry despite, standing in precipitation for God knows how long. I said, what happened to you? She said, I was on the bridge. It was November, cold like this. I was supposed to meet someone, but they didn't come, and I started walking back toward the junction, and a car came over the bridge too fast, and the guardrail she stopped. She said, the guardrail was wrong. It gave way. I stood in the drizzle on the shoulder of Route 9 and listened to a girl in a dry coat tell me that she had gone through the guardrail of the Bellam Creek Bridge. I said, when? She said, I don't know exactly. It was November. It was cold like this. I was 17. I said, what year? She looked at me with the patient expression she'd had the first time. She said, I'm not sure that's the right question. She got in the cruiser. I drove north toward Colford Junction, slower this time, watching the rear view more than I should have while driving a 2-lane highway in freezing rain. She was there, sitting in the back seat, hands in her lap, looking out the side window, visible. Real in every way I could observe. I said the thing you said last time, about the bridge not knowing it's over. She said, yes. I said, what did you mean? She said, when something bad happens in a place, the place remembers it. Most places remember and then slowly forget, the way people do. But some places, she paused, some places hold on. The bridge held on. I said, held on to what? She said, to that night. To the car and the guardrail and the cold and me. It keeps it. Like a loop that doesn't know how to stop. I said, and you're part of the loop. She said, I'm the part that keeps trying to get out. I said, by getting to Colford Junction. She said, I was supposed to be in Colford Junction. That's where I was going. I think if I can get there, if someone can get me there, it closes. The loop closes. I said, but last time you didn't make it. She said, no. I think it depends on, she stopped. I think it depends on how solid I am. Some nights, I'm more here than others. Tonight feels different. Tonight feels more real. She was right that tonight felt different. Last time she'd been a presence, a shape, something that occupied the back seat without quite filling it. Tonight she had weight. The seat compressed slightly under her, the small physical fact of a person sitting in it. I drove. 4 miles. 3 miles. The lights of Colford Junction starting to appear on the horizon, the orange glow of the town against the low cloud cover. 2 miles, 1 mile. I said, we're almost there. She said, I know. I can feel it. 1/2 mile. The gas station visible ahead, the lit sign, the orange light. I said, Lee. What was the name of the person you were supposed to meet? She said, why? I said, I want to know. She said quietly, Danny Holt. I pulled into the gas station parking lot. I put the cruiser in park. I turned around. She was there. Still there. I said, you made it. She looked at me with an expression I still think about. Not relief, exactly. Something older than relief. The face of someone who has been trying to finish a thing for a very long time and has finally reached the end of it. She said, thank you. The drizzle ticked against the roof of the cruiser. The gas station sign hummed. When I looked back again, she was gone. But this time, the door hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave, and I didn't feel the absence the way I had the first time. The first time it had been wrong, a sudden nothing where something had been. This time it was the absence of someone who had arrived where they were going. I sat in the parking lot for a while. Then I drove back to the substation and started working on what I was going to look up in the morning. The county records office opened at 8:30. I was there at 8:45 with a coffee I didn't touch. I asked the clerk for accident reports on State Route 9 at or near mile marker 9, specifically incidents involving the Bellam Creek Bridge. She looked at me with a mildly suspicious expression that clerks give law enforcement who ask for records that aren't related to a current case. I told her it was background research for a road safety report. She accepted this with the skepticism it deserved and went to pull the files. She came back with a thin folder. She said, there have been 3 reported incidents at that bridge. A fender bender in 1987, a deer strike in 2003, and, she paused, reading, and a fatality in 1974. I said, "Tell me about the fatality." She read from the report. Female juvenile, age 17, deceased. Vehicle went through the guardrail on the north side of the Bellam Creek Bridge on State Route 9. November 14th, 1974. Victim was on foot on the bridge when struck by a northbound vehicle that lost control on the wet road surface. The guardrail gave way on impact. Victim went into the creek. Body recovered the following morning. She looked up. She said her name was Lee Carver. I wrote that down. I said, "Was there a passenger in the vehicle or a third party at the scene?" She checked. She said the driver was a man named Gerald Foss. No passengers, no witnesses. There's a note here that a Daniel Holt was interviewed as a person of interest. The victim had reportedly been waiting to meet him at Colford Junction. He was cleared. He was out of state at the time. I sat back in the plastic chair in the county records office and looked at the ceiling. She had been waiting for Danny Holt. He hadn't come. She'd started walking toward the junction, and a car had come over the bridge too fast on a wet November night, and the guardrail had given way, and she'd gone into Bellam Creek. She had been 17 years old, and she had been trying to get to Colford Junction for 49 years. I drove back out to mile marker 9 that afternoon. Parked in the pull-off on the north side of the bridge. Got out and stood on the gravel and looked at the guardrail. It was the original guardrail, I realized. Not the same age as the road. The road had been repaved at least twice since 1974. You could see it in the shoulder material. But the guardrail was old steel, painted over so many times it had a slightly rounded look. And along the north side, there was a section maybe 8 feet wide where the steel looked newer than the surrounding rail. A replacement.
The section they'd fixed after the accident. I stood at the rail and looked down at Bellam Creek. Brown water over flat rocks, shallow this time of year, the November sky grey above it. I'd driven this bridge 11 years worth of overnight shifts. Hundreds of times. And for at least some of those times, a girl had been standing in the pull-off behind me as I crossed, trying to get to a place she'd been going since 1974. I thought about the night before and the way she'd said, "I can feel it," when we were half a mile from the junction. And the way she'd looked when I'd turned around in the parking lot and she was still there. I thought about, thank you. I've been back to mile marker 9 on every overnight shift since then. That's been about 8 months now. The pull-off has been empty every time. No one standing in the headlights. No one waiting. I don't know what I believe about what happened. I'm a state trooper. My job is evidence and procedure and things I can put in a report. What happened on those 2 nights in October and November doesn't fit in a report, and I've stopped trying to make it. What I know is this: something that had been waiting a long time got where it was going. And the pull-off at mile marker 9 has been empty ever since. I hope it stays that way. But some nights, driving northbound through that dip in the road, I slow down before the bridge. Just a little. Just enough to give my headlights time to sweep the pull-off before I cross. Old habit. Or maybe I'm still checking. I'm not entirely sure anymore which one it is.
I'll tell you up front that I'm a detective, which means I deal in evidence. Facts I can photograph, fingerprints I can lift, timelines I can reconstruct from phone records and witness statements and security footage. That's my job. That's what I'm trained to do, and I'm good at it. 22 years on the job, 18 of those in investigations, and I have closed cases that other detectives had written off as unsolvable. I'm telling you that because what I'm about to describe is something I have spent 3 years trying to explain with the tools I use every day, and I cannot. I have the case file. I have the photographs. I have the dispatch logs and my own notes, and a report filed by a patrol officer who saw the same things I saw and wrote them up with the same careful vagueness that I used, because there is no box on a police report form for what we found at 411 Marin Street. Let me start at the beginning. In September of 2021, our department received a missing persons report on a man named Garrett Hollies, 44 years old, self-employed contractor, lived alone at 411 Marin Street in the Calvert district. The report was filed by his sister, who lived 2 states away and had been unable to reach him for 11 days. She called his cell, his landline emailed, nothing. She called the neighbor, who said Garrett's truck was in the driveway and the lights came on and off in the house, but no one had seen him in person for over a week. I caught the case on a Monday morning. Standard missing persons protocol. Start with the residence, establish whether there's any sign of the subject, work outward from there. I drove to Marin Street with a patrol officer named Becker, a solid cop with 8 years on the job who I'd worked with before and trusted. 411 Marin Street was a 2-story craftsman house in a quiet residential block, the kind of neighborhood where the houses are old enough to have character and well-maintained enough that you can see people care about them. Garrett Hollies' house fit the block, clean porch, maintained yard, a contractor's van in the driveway with the company name on the side, Hollies Home Repair. We knocked. No answer. We walked the perimeter. No signs of disturbance, no broken windows, nothing in the yard that shouldn't have been there. The neighbor 2 doors down, a retired woman named Mrs. Pace, came out to her porch and waved us over. She confirmed what the sister had said. Lights on and off in the house, truck in the driveway, no sign of Garrett in person. She said it had been 12 days since she'd actually seen him, which she remembered because she'd waved to him from her yard on a Thursday afternoon, and he'd waved back and said something about finishing a job in the Westbrook neighborhood. We got authorization for entry. Becker and I went in. The house was clean and orderly. Not the sterile cleanness of a place that's been staged or wiped down, the lived-in tidiness of someone who had a system and kept to it. Tools organized in the utility room, dishes clean in the rack, the living room straightened but with the small disorder of actual habitation. A book face down on the couch, a coffee mug on the side table, a pair of work boots by the front door. No Garrett Hollies. We went room by room. Living room, kitchen, dining room, utility room, downstairs bathroom. Then upstairs, 2 bedrooms, the master, and a smaller room he used as an office, a full bath. Nothing alarming in any of them. The master bedroom was made, the office was organized, the bathroom was dry. I was in the office looking at his desk when Becker called from downstairs. He said, "Webb, come look at this." I went down. He was in the kitchen, standing at the door to the basement. The door was open. From where I stood, I could see the top of the basement stairs, and below, a light already on, a bare bulb somewhere at the bottom of the stairs, casting a pale yellow light upward. I said, "Did you open this?" He said, "No." It was like this when I came back through. I looked at the door. Old-style door, wooden, with a simple knob. No lock on it. Could have swung open on its own if the latch wasn't catching. Old houses have doors like that. I went down the stairs first. The basement was a finished workspace. The kind of basement a contractor turns into a second shop. A workbench along one wall, pegboards with tools hanging in silhouette, shelving with labeled bins of hardware. A concrete floor with a drain in the center. A utility sink. A second door at the far end of the basement, closed, that I assumed led to a crawl space or outdoor access. No Garrett Hollies, but the workbench had something on it. A legal pad, a pencil resting in the spine, and on the top sheet, in handwriting I would later confirm was Garrett's, a list. Numbered 12 items, the kind of list a contractor makes when he's planning a job. Materials, measurements, notes about sequence. The last item on the list, number 12, was underlined twice. It said, "Don't go back downstairs." I stood at the workbench and read that line 3 times. I said, "Becker." He came over and read it. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's not a materials list." I said, "No, it's not." We processed the house that afternoon. The full routine, photographs of every room, the legal pad bagged as evidence, a second walkthrough looking for anything we'd missed. Becker found a phone charger plugged in by the bed with no phone attached. I found a wallet in the kitchen drawer, cash, cards, ID, all present. You don't go missing and leave your wallet in a kitchen drawer unless you left very suddenly or didn't intend to go anywhere. We canvassed the block. 3 neighbors confirmed the timeline. Garrett Hollies had been seen on a Thursday, waved to Mrs. Pace mentioned a job in Westbrook. After that, nothing. His truck hadn't moved. His phone, which we couldn't find, had last pinged a cell tower 3 blocks from Marin Street on that same Thursday evening at 6:42 p.m. After that, nothing. I called the Westbrook job. A family named Denner, kitchen remodel. Garrett had finished the job on Thursday, they said. Left around 5. Seemed normal. They paid him by check, which he'd cashed at a bank branch on the way home. We confirmed this from the bank's records. He'd cashed the check at 5:58 p.m. and been captured on the bank's exterior camera walking toward the parking lot. That was the last confirmed sighting of Garrett Hollies. He'd driven home, his truck was there, so we assumed he made it back, and then disappeared from his own house sometime between 6 p.m. on a Thursday and the following Thursday when his sister started making calls. I went home that night and I thought about the legal pad. Don't go back downstairs. A man who wrote himself a warning and then apparently didn't take it. Or did, and it hadn't helped. 3 weeks into the investigation, I had no leads that were going anywhere. Garrett Hollies had no known enemies, no debts that anyone knew of, no history of mental health crises, no reason to vanish voluntarily. His sister was calling every 2 days. The case was active but stalling. And then dispatch got a call from 411 Marin Street. I was at my desk when the duty sergeant came over and told me. He said, "Someone called from your missing persons address. Called 911, said there was an intruder. Patrol is on the way." I said, "The house has been locked and sealed since we processed it 3 weeks ago." He said, "I know." I grabbed my jacket and drove to Marin Street. Patrol had beaten me there. 2 officers I didn't know well, Duval and Park, standing on the porch with their hands on their belts. The front door was closed. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks ago, down to the contractor's van still in the driveway. I said, "What did dispatch say about the call?" Duval said, "Male caller stated his name as Garrett Hollies, said there was someone in his basement." Call lasted about 40 seconds. Caller sounded, she paused. Caller sounded like he was trying to be quiet. Like he was whispering. I said, "Garrett Hollies has been missing for 3 weeks." She said, "I know. That's why they called you." I unlocked the front door with the key from the evidence lockup. We went in. The house was exactly as we'd left it. Sealed, untouched, 3 weeks of settled dust on the surfaces. No sign of entry, no sign of disturbance. We cleared the ground floor in 4 minutes. Then I stood at the basement door. It was open. I had locked that door myself. It didn't have a key lock, but I'd secured it with a hasp and padlock from the outside. The hasp was still mounted. The padlock was on the floor, open, the shackle released, as if someone had used a key to open it from the inside. From the inside, where there was no keyhole. I looked down the stairs. The light was on again. The same bare bulb, the same pale yellow light from the bottom of the stairs. I went down. The basement was the same as I'd left it. Workbench, tools, shelving, concrete floor. The legal pad gone, bagged into evidence 3 weeks ago. Everything in place, except the second door at the far end of the basement was open. The one I'd assumed led to a crawl space. It didn't lead to a crawl space. It led to another room. I'm going to describe what I saw when I looked through that door as precisely as I can, because I have thought about it almost every day since, and I want the description to be accurate rather than shaped by what I later found out. The room was approximately 15 by 20 feet, unfinished, bare concrete block walls, concrete floor, a single fluorescent fixture in the ceiling. It had the look of a room that had been used as storage and then cleared out. Along the far wall, a wooden shelf unit, empty. Along the left wall, a workbench similar to the one in the main basement, but smaller, older, the surface darkened with age and use. On the workbench, a legal pad. A pencil in the spine. I walked to the workbench. Becker and Duval were behind me, park at the door. No one said anything. The legal pad had writing on it. The same handwriting as the first pad. The same careful contractor's print. But this wasn't a materials list. It said, "I've been trying to get out for a long time. I don't know how long. The basement is wrong. The room at the back is wrong. Something is in the walls of that room, and I don't mean structurally. I can hear it move at night." I wrote the warning on the other pad, so whoever came in next wouldn't make the same mistake I did. "Don't go back downstairs." I wrote that for the next person. I didn't think I'd be writing another one. The next line said, "If you're reading this, you're already downstairs. I'm sorry. Get out now. Don't come back after dark. Whatever you do, don't let it hear you moving around down here." The final line said, "My name is Garrett Hollis. I live at this address. I don't know what day it is anymore." I stood at that workbench in a room that hadn't existed the first time I'd searched this basement, and I read that legal pad twice, and I thought about a man who had been missing for 3 weeks and had somehow called 911 from a house that had been sealed and locked. I said quietly, to no one in particular, "Get out. Everyone upstairs now." Nobody argued. We came out of the house, and I stood on the sidewalk, and I breathed the September afternoon air, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. Becker said, "Webb, that room wasn't there last time." I said, "I know." He said, "The floor plan of the house doesn't have a room like that." I checked the county records when we first processed the scene. The basement is listed as an unfinished utility space, approximately 300 square feet. What we just walked through was at least twice that. I said, "I know." He said, "And the note?" I said, "I know, Becker." He said, "So what do we do?" I thought about that. I'm a detective. My tools are evidence and procedure. I had a legal pad with writing on it. I had a room that shouldn't exist. I had a 911 call from a man who had been missing for 3 weeks. I had more evidence than I usually start a case with. None of it fit any category I had a protocol for. I said, we treat it as an active scene. We call the forensics team, we document the room, we get the legal pad processed. We treat it like any case. Becca said, and if he's still in there? I said, we keep looking. I didn't say, and if he's in there, but not in a way that our looking can reach him. I didn't say that because I wasn't ready to say it out loud. But I thought it. Forensics came. They photographed the room, processed the workbench, bagged the legal pad. They also confirmed, when they measured, that the secondary room extended past the exterior foundation line of the house by approximately 6 feet, which meant part of the room was, according to the physical laws of architecture, under the backyard. The forensics lead, a woman named Torres who had more years on the job than me and less patience for things that didn't make sense, looked at her measurements and then looked at me and said, "That's not possible." I said, "I know." She said, "Structurally, there's no." I said, "I know, Torres." She said, "Okay. I'm putting it in my report, exactly as measured. Someone else can explain it." Nobody ever did. The forensics team found one more thing in the secondary room. Along the base of the far wall, in the gap between the bottom of the wall and the concrete floor, there was a series of marks. Small, regular, made with something sharp, a nail or a pocket knife or the tip of a pencil. Tally marks. The kind of marks someone makes to count days. There were 91 of them. Garrett Hollies had been missing for 22 days when we found the second room. 91 tally marks, if they were days, meant something different. Something I wasn't ready to calculate out loud in front of the forensics team. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table and I did the math. 22 days had passed for us. If the tally marks were days, 3 months had passed for him. I thought about the legal pad. I don't know what day it is anymore. I thought about a man in a basement room that extended past the walls of his own house, making marks on the concrete to keep track of a time that wasn't moving at the same speed as the time above his head. I went back to Marin Street the next morning, alone before anyone else arrived. I stood at the top of the basement stairs. I said, "Garrett, if you can hear me, this is Detective Webb. I'm going to get you out of there. I need you to stay where you are and keep making noise." Silence from below. Then faint, so faint that I have questioned whether I heard it or manufactured it in the specific way that desperate people manufacture what they need to hear, a sound. Not words, a tap. 2 taps on something hollow, the kind of sound a person makes on a pipe or a wall when they want you to know they're there. Then nothing. I'm going to tell you what happened over the following 3 weeks, and I'm going to tell it as a sequence of facts, because that's the only way I can get through it. We brought in a structural engineer to assess the secondary room. He confirmed what Torres had found. The room extended past the foundation by 6 feet. He could not explain this. He said in his written report that the structure appeared sound and that the extension was physically present, but that he had no architectural explanation for how it existed. He recommended further investigation by a specialist. No specialist was ever identified who could help. We brought in a thermal imaging unit to scan the walls of the secondary room for heat signatures. The scan showed an anomaly in the far wall, a heat source approximately 2 feet inside the concrete block, roughly human in size and shape. The thermal technician said it was consistent with a living person. We could not access it. The wall was solid block, no cavities, no openings. The thermal signature was there, and the wall was solid, and both of those things were true at the same time. We brought in audio equipment and ran a listening session for 6 hours. We recorded sounds consistent with movement, slow, irregular, the sound of someone shifting position from the same location as the thermal signature. The recording exists. I have a copy. I have listened to it many times. We could not get to him. On the 44th day of his disappearance, the 44th day for us, God knows what number for him, a legal pad appeared on the workbench in the secondary room overnight. The house had been locked, alarmed, and under observation. No one had entered. The pad was there in the morning when Becca did the check. It said, "I can hear you." I've been able to hear you for a long time. I don't know how long. I'm in the wall. I know that sounds impossible. I know. It started as a room, and then it was smaller, and then I was in it, and now I'm in the wall and I can't move much, but I can hear you, and sometimes I can do this. I don't know how. It said, "Please don't stop coming. Whatever you're doing, it's keeping me. I think it's keeping me anchored." When you're in the room, I feel more real. When no one is here for a long time, I start to feel less real, and that's the part that scares me most. It said, "Tell my sister I'm okay." I know that's a strange thing to say, but tell her. I called his sister. I didn't tell her about the wall. I told her we had reason to believe Garrett was alive, and that we were doing everything we could. She cried. I sat on the phone for 20 minutes. After I hung up, I went back to Marin Street, and I sat in the secondary room and I talked. Out loud to the wall. I told him what we'd tried and what we were going to try next. I don't know if he could hear me. I kept going anyway, because the note had said it helped, and that was the only tool I had. On the 61st day, the thermal signature was gone. We'd been running the thermal scan every morning. 60 mornings of a human-shaped heat source in the far wall of a basement room that extended past the foundation. On morning 61, nothing. The wall was cold and uniform and empty. No note that morning. No sounds on the audio, nothing. I sat in the secondary room for 4 hours. I talked to the wall until I ran out of things to say, and then I sat in silence. Becca came down at noon. He sat beside me. He didn't say anything either. After a while he said, "What do you think happened?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Do you think he got out?" I said, "I don't know what out means in this context." He said, "But you think he's not in there anymore?" I said, "I think whatever was holding him here released him." Where that puts him, I genuinely don't know. Becca nodded. He's not the kind of cop who pushes for more certainty than a situation has. I've always respected that about him. We cleared the house that afternoon. The case remains open. Garrett Hollies is listed as a missing person. The secondary room is documented in the case file with photographs and measurements and forensic reports that describe, in careful neutral language, things that have no neutral explanation. I still drive past 411 Marin Street sometimes. The house has been locked since we cleared it. His sister has power of attorney now, and she's left it alone, not ready to sell it, not ready to do anything with it. The contractor's van is still in the driveway. Someone misses. Pace, I think, mows the lawn. The last note Garrett Hollies wrote is in the evidence file. I've read it so many times, I have it memorized. He wrote, "The room keeps shrinking. I think it's almost done with me." I don't know what that means, but I'm not afraid. I want to put that on record. I'm a contractor. I build things and I fix things, and I understand that some structures can't be saved. Sometimes you have to let the old thing go so the new thing can stand. I think that's what's happening. I'm not afraid. He wrote, Tell whoever reads this that the house is just a house now. Whatever was in the walls is done. You don't have to be scared of it. He wrote, I was here. That's enough. 3 years later, I still don't know where Garrett Hollis went. I have a file full of evidence that documents something I can't explain and a last note from a missing man who wasn't afraid. I'm a detective. I deal in evidence. The evidence says something happened in that basement that I don't have a category for. And the evidence says he faced it without flinching. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the room, not the wall, not the tally marks. The last line. I was here. That's enough. I think about that more than I probably should.